Joel, I've got a multiple choice quiz for you.
Yeah.
So, what would you do if you finally defeated like a terrible, dastardly foe? Would you
Yeah.
A, declare a national holiday,
Mm-hmm.
B, knit a commemorative sweater,
Hmm.
or C, write songs calling your enemy names?
Can't be the sweater. So, I mean, probably not. So I'm saying C, write songs calling your enemy names.
Negative, Ghost Rider. It's A, declare a national holiday.
I'm Joel Miller.
And I'm Jamie Bennett.
And this is Bad Books of the Bible.
It's a podcast about a collection of books with a curious pedigree and an even stranger legacy. In the last episode, we mentioned that the Seleucid general Nicanor was killed. The people rejoiced greatly and celebrated that day as a day of great gladness, the narrator says. They decreed that this day should be celebrated each year on the 13th of Adar. Adar?
Shouldn't be that hard.
It shouldn't be. This new holiday is emphasized in 2 Maccabees, which provides a bit more detail.
Okay.
And in 2 Maccabees, it says, and they all decree by public vote never to let this day go unobserved, but to celebrate the 13th of the 12th month, which is called Adar in the Aramaic language, the day before Mordecai's Day.
Before we get back to this holiday, let's remind listeners that this is now not one, but two, the second holiday to come out of First Maccabees. First, there's Hanukkah, which, by the way, is underway right now. If you're listening to this when the show drops, and Yom Nicanor, or Nicanor's Day. Given their conspicuous presence in the narrative, I think it's actually worth a few minutes reflecting on festivals and holy days more generally.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And there are 3 main Jewish holidays and several smaller ones. Now, the 3 big ones are called High Holy Days. Those are like Rosh Hashanah. This kicks off the Israelite New Year. It falls in September, October. Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, that's next. This also falls between September and October, and it's just a few weeks after Rosh Hashanah. Now, originally, this was a day of fasting and sacrifice, and this is when the high priest entered the Holy of Holies. Then, of course, there's Passover, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
Yeah.
It's probably the best known of the holidays because it's central to the Exodus story, which, of course, is one of the best known stories in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, it's like a foundational narrative. These holidays, these are commemorative, right? They're designed to bring our minds back to either initiating or ongoing events so that we don't lose touch with their significance in our lives. And the Bible shows us several of these. Some of these are set by God, others are set by his people. We've got, beyond the 3 that we just mentioned, there's the Festival of Weeks. This is also called Pentecost or Shavuot. It's related to Passover because, as the name Pentecost sounds like, it comes 50 days later. It's the Greek term, 50 days later. And that celebrates the wheat harvest. There's also the Festival of Booths, sometimes called Tabernacles. This holiday is about celebrating the harvest and commemorates the Israelite wanderings when they lived in tents or booths. It's celebrated in October and marks the end of a trio of holidays. We've already mentioned 2. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur both lead into the Festival of Booths.
Yeah. And what's interesting is there are 2 other holidays attached to booths, Shemini Atzeret and Simchat Torah. All right. I tried really hard on those and I felt pretty good about it.
I think you nailed it.
So Shemini Atzeret takes place 8 days after the Festival of Booths. And I think it literally means 8th assembly or 8th day of assembly.
Yeah.
Along with that day comes the Festival of Simchat Torah, which is all about celebrating God's gift of the Torah.
Yeah. And that brings us to Hanukkah. Now, we've already covered the place of Hanukkah in First Maccabees a few episodes. 2 Maccabees makes several additional references that help us understand this a bit further. So in 2 Maccabees, it refers to the holiday as the Festival of Booths in the month of Kislev. Now, that's interesting because Booths is not celebrated in that month.
Yeah.
So what's going on here? Kislev is between November and December. The Festival of Booths falls 2 months earlier. but there is still a connection. And Second Maccabees actually tells us what it is. So I'm going to go ahead and just read this little passage here.
Yeah.
They celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the Festival of Booths. So they celebrated Hanukkah the same way they celebrated the Festival of Booths.
Okay.
Remembering how not long before, during the Festival of Booths, they had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. Therefore, carrying ivy-wreathed wands and beautiful branches and also fronds of palm, they offered hymns of thanksgiving to him who had given success to the purifying of his holy place. They decreed by public edict, ratified by vote, that the whole nation of the Jews should observe these days every year.
Wow.
Hanukkah actually kind of begins as like a belated celebration of booths.
Wow.
So they couldn't celebrate booths because they were wandering through the mountains and caves like wild animals, it says. So now 2 months later, they do celebrate it. And they have another reason, which is, of course, the purification of the temple. So it's like this holiday takes on all new meaning and a whole new like valence. But there is even more to this story. Don't forget the temple, because there is another connection here. And that is that the original dedication of the temple, which we find out in 1 Kings chapter 8, that actually happened during the original Feast of Booths. So there's an echo of booths in Hanukkah, and the two reference each other essentially. But there's also a coincidence of days. Hanukkah has 8 days, so does booths, if you count that 8th day, the Shemini Atzeret.
Well, finally, there's Purim. And Purim goes back to the book of Esther. This celebrates God's deliverance of his people who were then living in the Persian Empire. Now, if you know that story, Haman, he had plans to wipe out the Jews. And he actually was so flippant about it, he threw lots to decide on when to take action. Purim literally means lots.
Yeah. Like, don't forget what Einstein said. God doesn't throw dice.
Yeah. Instead of dice, God uses Queen Esther to undermine Haman's plot and save his people.
Yeah.
And this takes us back to Nicanor Day. Why don't the Jews celebrate Nicanor Day like it says they should in 1st and 2nd Maccabees? Well, for the writer of 2nd Maccabees, Purim is called Mordecai's Day. Mordecai is Esther's uncle.
Mm-hmm.
Nicanor Day was celebrated the day before Purim. But while the days nearly overlapped, the people celebrating did not.
Tell me more.
Purim was a celebration that began with the community that was in exile. Celebrating it in Jerusalem just did not come automatically.
Right.
Besides, they had their own day that celebrated almost the same thing, right? God's deliverance of his people.
And that's Yom Nicanor, Nicanor's day.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But remember we talked about why the book of 1st Maccabees fell out of favor with the Jews?
Yes.
That's connected. The book of 1st Maccabees and Nicanor Day both were overwhelmingly seen as Hasmonean.
Okay.
The rabbis who ended up becoming the spiritual authorities of the Jewish community were not fans of the Hasmoneans at that point, in part for reasons we'll see in today's episode. Now, the rabbis ultimately edge out 1st Maccabees and 2nd Maccabees, really, out of any official recognition. And the rabbis' favored holiday, Purim, also edged Nicanor Day out of the calendar.
So that explains the fate of Nicanor's Day. But several of the other holidays we've already talked about, they have ongoing observance throughout this period and beyond. So we even find these Jewish holidays mentioned in the bad books of the Bible. And since there's not a lot of familiarity with these books, I thought it might be worthwhile mentioning a few of these. So for instance, Jubilees, which is not actually in the bad books as we're defining them.
A badder book?
It's a badder book of the Bible. That's right. Jubilees in chapter 5 talks about the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. It says, it is written and ordained that he, God, will show mercy to all who turn from their guilt once a year. That's a reference to Yom Kippur. In Baruch chapter 1, it also gives us a reference to the same thing. It mentions that the people should read aloud the scroll, which is the book of Baruch, to make their confession in the house of the Lord on the days of the festivals at appointed seasons. So this day of confession is mentioned there.
Wow.
And then, of course, after that, in that same passage, follows a confession of sin.
Yeah.
And then the book of Sirach in chapter 50, we're going to cover Sirach in a future episode. We'll cover Baruch later too.
Right.
But there could be a reference to Yom Kippur there. The experts are divided. It could just be a daily temple service that's referenced.
Interesting.
All right, then there's booths. So we talked about booths. That's referenced in First Esdras. In fact, the line there in First Esdras chapter 5 says they kept the festival of booths as it is commanded in the law and offered the proper sacrifices every day.
And of course, there's Hanukkah, which we already talked about in First Maccabees, but it's also in Second Maccabees chapter 10.
Yep. Then there's Passover, which is covered in books like Wisdom and First Esdras, and Pentecost, which pops up in Second Maccabees, and of course, our old friend Tobit.
Yes.
In fact, people may recall that Tobit is celebrating Pentecost when he goes blind.
Right.
So that's one of those connections here. But these holidays are also, of course, commemorated in the New Testament.
Yeah.
And particularly Jesus is noted for his observance of these festivals, as well, ultimately, as some of their transformations.
Virtually all Christians, of course, would connect with the holidays of Pascha and Pentecost,
Yep.
which came over from a Jewish observance that was transformed into a slightly different Christian observance of these holidays.
Yep. And then there's Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when the priest enters the Holy of Holies. That's exactly what the author of Hebrews says Jesus did once and for all in Hebrews chapter 9.
Yeah.
And there's a note in the Jewish annotated New Testament that says this about that. Hebrews is interpreting Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection in terms of their salvific efficacy. His death is analogous to the Yom Kippur sacrifice, and his resurrection and ascension to the heavenly realm are analogous to the high priest's entry into the Holy of Holies.
Wow.
So from the Christian perspective, these holidays have been fulfilled in Christ, or we could say transfigured by Christ.
Yeah, but as far as First Maccabees is concerned, that's still in the future. First Maccabees has a lot of lessons for the attentive reader. Now, a couple episodes we mentioned a simple fact that empires simply don't last.
Yeah.
One reason is that the same arrogance and pride that really drives that empire building also drives the competition, leading to the destabilization of empires.
Oops, it's a little bit self-defeating.
We saw that with the way Alexander's empire was forged and then later just fragmented.
Yep.
We saw that with the power plays after Antiochus IV's death. You know, there was Philip, then Lysias, Antiochus V, and then, of course, Demetrius.
Right.
And now another.
Oh, no.
The namesake of both the man who started the whole ball rolling and the madman who kept it going, Alexander Epiphanes.
Dum, dum, dum.
What a name.
He's supposedly another one of Antiochus's kids, Antiochus IV's kids. It's a lucky thing that he didn't name himself after his dad, given what happened to Antiochus V. But when Alexander rears his head, he sets up shop in the coastal town of Ptolemais, which will come up again. But he sets up shop there, and Demetrius needs to act like ASAP because now there's this challenger to his rule. So he figures it's better to patch up relations with Jonathan.
Yeah.
So in our last episode, Jonathan takes over from Judas, and he becomes the leader of the Maccabean kind of group, the people that will later be called the Hasmonean dynasty. And Demetrius, he says this, he says, let us act first to make peace with him before he makes peace with Alexander against us. For he will remember all the wrongs that we did to him and to his brothers and his nation. Like no fooling, right? Demetrius is still technically in charge of Judea. That is, Judea is part of the Seleucid Empire,
right?
Regardless of how, troubled and tenuous its grip is.
Mm-hmm.
But in his role as sovereign, he grants Jonathan permission to raise an army and then be enlisted as an ally, right?
Right.
Beyond that, he agrees to free the hostages that we mentioned last time. These are people currently stashed in the citadel in the Acra.
Yeah. Those terms Demetrius leads out were sent in a letter.
Yeah.
And so Jonathan reads this letter to the people in Jerusalem, and he does so right by the Acra, within earshot of the citadel.
Right.
Now, the people are quite unnerved about this. When they hear that Demetrius wants them to arm themselves, what's going on here?
This can't be good.
But the anxiety has calmed a bit when the citadel doors open and the captives come out.
Oh, wow.
Now that they're back in the good graces of the Seleucids, maybe it'd be better to say good politics. Jonathan moves his base from Michmash back to Jerusalem.
Yep.
He starts to fortify the town, and Seleucid forces hightail it from the line of forts that Maccabees had erected.
So this is like a transfer of power thing happening here, basically. Jonathan is reasserting authority in Jerusalem with the blessing of Demetrius.
Yeah. And in this shuffle, many of the Jews who had, assimilated, the Hellenistic Tories who are Hasmonean patriots,
right?
They ran to Beth Zur, which stood as a safe zone. This was, according to the narrator, like a place of refuge for them.
That's like a callback to the Mosaic Law, this idea of like a safe zone or a safe city. And that means it's worth remembering that these people weren't safe outside the city, potentially.
In earlier episodes, we talked about the fame of these Maccabean boys, right? Like everybody loved them. Even their pagan neighbors were impressed by them.
Yeah.
They had a lot of, spunk and tenacity. But of course, they also had a lot of violent stabbing, slashing, and beheading. So
you got to respect that.
Well, one of the pagans who heard that these guys were, all that in a bag of Seleucid heads was none other than Alexander. And Demetrius was right to be worried. Alexander heard about Demetrius's offer, and then he extends one of his own.
Okay.
So he makes Jonathan an offer he couldn't refuse. And the narrator includes his message here. He says, King Alexander to his brother Jonathan, greetings.
Hang on. Let's just mention this real quick here. These are the same guys.
Right.
These are their enemies. And here they are, brother Jonathan.
Yeah.
He's got to talk up. This is a lot of kissing up right here.
Yeah. This is some serious political schmoozing.
Yep.
So he addresses him as a brother, right? King Alexander to his brother Jonathan, greetings. We have heard about you, that you are a mighty warrior and worthy to be our friend. And so we have appointed you today to be the high priest of your nation.
Yeah.
You're to be called the king's friend, and you're to take our side and keep friendship with us.
Yeah.
So being part of the king's friend is like you're part of the Seleucid ruling class.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
It's a big invitation. The narrator adds another detail. He also sent him a purple robe and a golden crown.
The sign of royalty. Now, the Seleucids had appointed chief priests in the past. Second Maccabees talks about this. It's not something that we may assume, but that's pretty common in the ancient world that the ruler would appoint the chief religious officer in whatever community. And that had been true in Israel at that time also. And Jonathan, he took the job. So it says that he donned the sacred vestments. Significantly, especially given our discussion of holy days, the text says he did this during the festival of booths. He also began to rebuild his army. The trick is, not everybody was a fan of this. Not only do the Maccabees still have their ongoing critics in Judea,
right,
but this move of him becoming high priest set off another group of people who had cause to not be fans. And the reason for this is that Alcimus, when he dies, which we talked about in the last episode, when he dies, the office of high priest is vacant until Jonathan steps in. But we know that there was another family, the traditional holders of that office, who probably should have been considered, and certainly they thought they should have been considered for that role. And Onias IV, he's the son of Onias III. There's a lot of naming people after each other. He should have been the one that got the position. Instead, he ended up leaving and going to Egypt and rebuilding supposedly a replica of the temple there. That's Josephus talks about that.
Oh, wow.
And it's often assumed that the impious priest that's referred to in the Qumran writings,
right,
the Essene sect that moved off to the Dead Sea area, that the impious priest that they talk about is actually Jonathan. So the Dead Sea Scroll community is in reaction to this appointment of Jonathan.
Yeah, they withdrew from the people
and
established their own community outside.
Exactly. And that's why their writings are so scurrilously against the official temple back in Jerusalem.
Demetrius catches wind of these developments and he just freaks out.
I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah,
his play didn't work.
He tries to preempt Alexander's plan. He didn't even like sweeten the deal the same way that Alexander had.
Right.
So Demetrius sends another letter.
Second try.
And this time he lays it on thick. Keep faith with us, says the king, and we will grant you many immunities and give you gifts. We're going to look the other way, and we're going to give you some good stuff to make sure you're happy.
This is just a straight buyout at this point.
So the letter rolls on for verse after verse after verse, like 19 verses in all.
Yep.
Here's a summary of what he's offering. He cancels their taxes.
Like their taxes, all of them.
Including annual fees paid by the temple, like in perpetuity, forever.
Wow.
And he says that tax fugitives can be forgiven and they can get their property back. He then offers them land, 3 districts from Samaria and Galilee, and he puts them under the control of Jerusalem and under the control of the high priest.
Which is now him, Jonathan.
Yes, and he offers to hand over the citadel so that the Jews can use it for their own defenses.
Wow.
He also releases any Jews held captive in his kingdom and eliminates the tax burdens that they might have.
Yep.
He says he'll free the Jews throughout the empire so that they can observe their holy days. I mean, this is what they've been wanting.
Yep.
No one shall have authority to annoy any of them about any matter, the text says.
You shall not annoy me.
I love these commandments. He gives Jewish soldiers a place in his army, and he even offers for them to serve in high positions.
Wow.
He gives them an annual allowance of 15,000 shekels. And finally, he agrees to foot the bill for rebuilding and restoring the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. In fact, he offers to restore all the walls throughout Judea.
Okay, so like, what's the response to this letter?
Negative, Ghost Rider. They totally just turned Demetrius down, cold.
The narrator says, when Jonathan and the people heard these words, they did not believe or accept them, because they remembered the great wrongs Demetrius had done in Israel and how much they had oppressed them.
Big surprise.
Instead, they backed Alexander. So, I mean, you can imagine how they might receive that. I mean, they were literally fighting this guy just like minutes ago,
right.
And he's like, no, we're like friends and you'll serve in my army and I'll forgive all your taxes and it's going to be amazing. We'll be pals again.
I'm a uniter, not a divider.
Right. Totally. They're like, no, you're a snake. This turned out, by the way, to be a very good move on the part of Jonathan and the Maccabees, because while these negotiations were underway, Alexander was pulling another army together. And it says that the kings met in battle. These two guys met in battle, Demetrius and Alexander, and Demetrius came up short. His bloody, brutal reign came to an end because so did he. He bit the dust at the end of the campaign against Alexander. Alexander, now that he's defeated Demetrius, he makes a quick alliance with the current Ptolemy in Egypt. Remember, there's like a Ptolemy every time you turn around, there's a new one. The current Ptolemy in Egypt, and the two rulers agree to a marriage. Alexander gets Ptolemy's daughter, Cleopatra, not that Cleopatra, different Cleopatra. And they celebrated the wedding in Ptolemais, the same place that Alexander started his rule from, with great pomp, as this is what the text says, with great pomp as kings do. So naturally,
of course.
It reminds me of Mel Brooks's History of the World, when he says, it's good to be the king. Despite all of that celebration, or in the midst of all that celebration, I should say, Alexander had not forgotten his alliance with Jonathan and Judea.
Yeah, and that's why he invites Jonathan to come to Ptolemais and be honored.
Mm-hmm.
And some of Jonathan's critics came to accuse him. They didn't like this.
Yeah.
But Alexander, he didn't pay any attention to them. He had Jonathan clothed in purple. He sat him at his side. He officially appointed him, as governor of Judea.
So he's high priest and governor.
Yes.
Like all the power.
All the power. And then he told his naysayers, bug off, scram.
Yep.
Alexander says, go out with him into the middle of the city and proclaim that no one is to bring charges against him about any matter. And here we go again.
Oh, no. annoyance must have been a real annoyance in those days.
Yeah, exactly. And naturally, the critics, they didn't want to stand up against this. They fled. And Jonathan went home just totally triumphant.
Okay, as is the running joke now, all these leaders have kids named after themselves, right? Demetrius, surprise, no different. And just like that, we have yet another power struggle in play. So Demetrius's son, Demetrius, hits the scene, and Alexander catches wind of this development, and he heads straight to Antioch to get ready for the fight. So we've got yet another battle brewing. Demetrius part 2,
right?
He appoints Apollonius as governor of really the area that is Lebanon and Palestine. He assembles an army, he camps at Jamnia, and he sends Jonathan a challenge. And I'm going to read this because this is big talk and this is kind of fun.
Yeah.
He says, if you now have confidence in your forces, come down to the plain to meet us, and let us match strength with each other there. For I have with me the power of the cities.
Ooh.
Ask and learn who I am and who the others are that are helping us. People will tell the bravado, the brazenness, and this is so great.
Just think about all my friends.
I've got powerful friends in powerful places. We are powerful. People will tell you that you cannot stand before us, for your ancestors were twice put to flight in their own land. And now, that's playing dirty pool right there. And now you will not be able to withstand my cavalry and such an army in the plain where there is no stone or pebble or place to flee. Like this letter with all of its bragging and braggadocio reminds me of this woman I used to work with named Bunny Snow. She would always say, "It's on." And like it's on, right? That's what's happening.
Yeah, it's really on. And so Jonathan has to jump in. He calls his troops and they attack one of Apollonius's garrisons in Joppa. And this ticks him off, right? Apollonius is hacked. So Apollonius mobilizes his army and his cavalry, and they go to fight with Jonathan at Azotus. Now, for those who are trying to keep track, I know we're throwing a lot of names and geography out there.
Yeah,
but this is like ancient Ashdod. It's an old territory of the Philistines.
So those guys are back in play also. I think that's a reference here on purpose for just like making sure we know that the Philistines.
Yeah,
those guys.
Now they almost got the better of them.
Yep.
And at one point they have Jonathan's men surrounded.
Yep.
The guys are pinned down. I mean, arrows are flying at them
for hours.
Yep. But Apollonius can't keep up the fight at this pace. The horses are getting tired. They're starting to scatter.
Which is funny because he was bragging on his cavalry in his big letter.
Yeah.
Apollonius can't recover from this. His army begins to retreat. They run back into the city of Azotus, including the temple of Dagon. So like, if you're like familiar with your Old Testament, we will have had many references to Dagon's temple in the past.
Yeah.
Jonathan's men, they overrun the city and they torch it.
Boom.
There's a note in the Navarre Bible that says this: Demetrius's general, Apollonius, fails to assess properly the strength of Jonathan's army. He thinks that they are no more than guerrillas, and he is routed. So all that big talk turned out to be nothing. Right after that, Jonathan moves against another Philistine city, the city of Ascalon. Instead of resisting, though, these guys, they're smarter. They come right out and they welcome him. They're like, hey,
right.
Hey, it's you. Battle averted. So Jonathan is victorious. He rides back to Jerusalem with the spoils of war.
Alexander hears that Jonathan and his men have bested Apollonius, and he wants to reward him. The text says that he sends him like a golden buckle. Remember that he had been given a robe, a purple robe earlier.
Yep.
So he gets this golden buckle. So it's probably like a shoulder buckle. Like I would love a shoulder buckle. It's probably like a brooch. So it says, such is the custom to give to the king's kinsmen, according to the narrator.
Yeah.
And he throws more real estate into the mix. I mean, he even gives him a city. He gives him the city of Ekron.
Yeah.
And so Jonathan now is loaded up with treasure, land, and all of these things. He's in a great place
Talk about a reversal of fortunes, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the Jewish people go from being under the thumb of the Seleucids to, thanks to these various political ploys and battles, now on in the good graces of at least one faction of the Seleucids, and ruling on their own again with autonomy in their own land.
And if you want to be in our good graces, visit badbooksofthebible.com, where you can subscribe to get our impeccable notes with our impeccable sources.
Impeccable.
You can follow us on Twitter. There's a link directly to our Ancient Faith show page, so it makes it easy to share with friends. And best of all, you will not miss a new episode. We've got some exciting content coming your way in the next few weeks. I'm Jamie Bennett.
And I'm Joel Miller.
And you've been listening to Bad Books of the Bible,
a production of Ancient Faith Radio. Come back next week when we find out just how convoluted politics can get.